Our first presenter this morning is Michael D'Angeli, who is a PhD candidate, but just this far because her final defense is April 14th. So, yay. Thank you for being here when you're really that close. So, we're really excited. Michael's work is pushing the boundaries of what art history considers, and I think this is very important work for us all to take a look at. So she's going to be our first presenter today, followed by Megan Smetzer, who has all of these three women, of course, are Bill Holmes Center grant recipients. And Megan was here doing research on Tlingit and Kwakwaka'wakw beadwork. And she is preparing a book on Tlingit beadwork for the Bill Holmes Center publication series in conjunction with the University of Washington Press, and we're all very excited about that. And she's going to talk about copper seaweed, woven octopus bags, Shken George, and the art of resilience. And Emily Moore, who is a new professor at Colorado State University, will be talking about the Nathan and Stephen Jackson house posts. So, welcome, Michael.
Well, lumgoda now nidzen, lumgoda now goya kisam. Skugo ski got a talk short way. Wooks am ik dealt watka. Amex, luck ubis koselish, musquim squamish at a slavatu, dealt zuggen. Oil system hatnis newsum at a heichka the duamish the sagam. In my language, I've said I'm very happy to see all of you here today. My real names, my Tsimshian name is Skugod Lakskig. My Tlingit name is Tauk Showat, and I'm from Wuukst and Medich, Metlakatla, Alaska. And it's an honor and a privilege to be here, to come back to the place where all of this started for me. I graduated with my bachelor's in art history with Robin as my advisor in 2002 from the University of Washington. And to come back just before I finish up my PhD, it's like a homecoming. There's so many people that I've seen over the past 2 days that some of you I haven't seen in over 10 years. So I really appreciate being here and all of the hard work of the organizers. Katie especially, thank you so much. And I also wanted to thank the beautiful opening that we had today by Joe. Thank you for your beautiful song and your work. And I really appreciated Katie's team and the sharing of Kwakwaka'wakw songs here in this space, because that's essentially the work that is the focus of my dissertation, is bringing our attention away from what art history does in terms of its focus on tangible artistic production, to think more critically about what we do when we separate the tangible and intangible artistic productions amongst our people in terms of this study. So the title of my paper today is Dance Group Performances as Art History in Motion, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit, as well as some other things that have really been on my heart in terms of the future of our field. So I would like to start by bringing our attention back to some of the generative discussions this morning about how we can proactively decolonize museum practices and engage in collaborative and community-based research. Building on the momentum of those discussions, I would like to begin with this question and begin what Maori scholar Linda Tahue Smith calls a courageous conversation. So courageous conversations are those that take risks, that may make people uncomfortable, that are difficult to have, but are important and necessary steps toward decolonizing the power dynamics that academic disciplines are founded on. Like I said, this is a very rare opportunity for us as Northwest Coast art historians to gather together to talk about how this field was founded, and I really enjoyed the genealogy that Robin put together in terms of the turn from anthropology to art history in our discipline, and essentially all the masters and apprentices, And where we're going now in the field, as I thought it was for me when I saw the lineup of speakers that we are the next generation. Essentially, we're leading scholars, as Katie was nice enough to call us, but also we're also a different generation of thinkers and how to think critically about the work that we do today and its effects on First Nations communities. So I asked this question that I've recently spent a lot of time with: how do we decolonize our historical practices? And thinking about that question, there's a whole series of questions that I'd like to put out there. What would decolonial methodological and theoretical approaches to researching, writing, teaching Indigenous art histories look like? How do we develop and implement them? What would be the result of decolonial teaching methodologies? In other words, how do we bring all of these decolonizing practices in museums that we talked about today, how do we bring that into the classroom? And think about our, as we say, I'm trying not to use as many big academic terms, but that's the nature of my training. Pedagogy. Pedagogy is another way of talking about the way that we teach and the curriculums that we build and how we train the next generation of scholars. So how do we decolonize those practices? I'd like to acknowledge that we've made major strides in the field to be more critical, self-reflexive, and work in partnership with First Nations communities in ways that are beneficial to their practices and to the communities and nations themselves. Scholars, for the most part, have moved away from colonial practices such as appropriation for the sake of revitalization or appropriation as a teaching and research methodology. Part of moving towards decolonial methods in the study of art history training is thinking critically about how our research questions, approaches, training, theoretical framework functions beyond the texts and exhibitions that we produce. In particular, in what ways does our work contribute to the marginalization of Indigenous art practices? How can we critically and reflexively examine, reframe, and change our practices to end such marginalization? There are examples of art forms with long-standing histories of marginalization, such as those that are typically thought to be carried out by women, which have been receiving more attention in the literature. This includes scholarship on a wide range of weaving practices that are produced by both men and women, and to a lesser extent beadwork, thanks to Megan Smetzer's scholarship. Despite these steps forward, there remains an array of Northwest Coast First Nations art practices that continue to be excluded. Some examples include installation work, like this piece by Tana Stelton, filmmaking, photography, multimedia, performance art, like that of Tahltan artist Peter Morin, for example, and other interdisciplinary art forms that are considered in ways which are also problematic to be more aligned with the contemporary art scene than with Northwest Coast art history. As we all know, Northwest Coast First Nations people, as other Indigenous peoples around the world, have an ancient practice of engaging with the tools and technologies of the times in which we live in order to express our contemporary realities. How do we research, write, present, and exhibit Northwest Coast art without compartmentalizing and marginalizing such a wide array of practices and reifying the polarization of contemporary and traditional? How do we break down the restrictive and exclusionary parameters used to define Northwest Coast art today? I'm not here to answer the questions that I've posed. They're far too complex for any one person to do so. My intention is to bring them into this important discussion about the future of our field. For the next portion of my paper, I will share with you how I'm working through some of these issues in my own scholarship. In an effort to decolonize my practices as an art historian, I've challenged myself to move away from the object-centric approaches of Western art historical methodologies. In Northwest Coast art history, performance is typically the context of research rather than the subject, with the exception now of the work that Katie and her Kwakwaka'wakw team members are doing, which is a wonderful example of the promising work that can be done in this area. My approach foregrounds dance group performances and practices, the practices through which they are created as an art form. The focus of my analysis is the artistic processes through which new songs, dances, and collaborations are created, and the ways in which dance group performances respond to and engage with intercultural contexts and audiences. Central to my research is the work of Sa'aplach, Bob Baker, leader of the Squamish dance group Spakwastolum, Gilda Dowett, Margaret Grenier, artistic director of the Gitsan dance company Dancers Adem Mohammed, and Wahuidi, William Wasden, leader of the Kwakwaka'wakw dance group Gwatwina. For those of you that might be unfamiliar with the term dance group, not troupe, not company, is commonly used by Northwest Coast First Nations people to refer to collectives of singers, drummers, dancers who perform songs and dances belonging to their nations, families, and communities. Each dance group has a very particular type of representation that is guided by their adherence to protocol. Protocol, as many of you in here will know, is immensely complex. It's an umbrella term that Northwest Coast people have adopted to talk about the laws of their nation, most of which is guided by hereditary rights. The fundamental connection between protocol and First Nations dance practices is that protocol governs the right to perform songs and dances and how performances occur. These rights, which again are primarily hereditary, are expressed through oratory at the time of the performance in terms of ownership and permission. Protocol governing dance group performances is entrenched in local politics, family, community, clan, and nation, and informs how their work engages with wider national, international, and provincial in Canada politics. Inherited rights to songs and dances, associated masks, headdresses, robes, and other forms of ceremonial regalia and wealth are fiercely protected, as they're not only integral to individual and collective identity, but also, in many cases, define ownership of territories, both land and waterways. There are now, on the Northwest Coast, upwards of 300 dance groups in both rural and urban communities, with new ones forming every year. But the scholarship on their performance is nearly non-existent. Judith Osterwitz is the only art historian that I'm aware of who has written about dance group performances, specifically those at Celebration. The lack of academic study is in part due to prevailing stereotypes about what it is that Northwest Coast dance groups do. In my experience as a dancer and dance group leader, as well as those that have been shared with me by others, it's strikingly common to be confronted with preconceived notions suggesting that our performances are merely routines of ancient songs and dances. This stereotype and many others discredit the work of dance group leaders, who I refer to as dance artists, who actively compose songs, choreograph dances, and arrange dance group performances of both new and ancestral songs. The interdisciplinary nature of my approach led to my engagement with the field of dance studies. The term dance artist is commonly used in that field to refer to dancers who are also choreographers, and I feel that this designation is more effective to speak about the work that dance group leaders do, because most of them are dance group leaders, composers, and choreographers Typically, one person maintains all three of those roles, or multiple people in dance group maintain 3 roles. My use of the term dance artist honors their efforts to maintain the knowledge and use of ancient songs and dances, as well as to build upon that knowledge to create new works. So similar with the discussion last night about the word art, which I'm always sad when conversations kind of go back to that, because the idea of there isn't one word in our language for art suggests that we weren't thinking about it in all sorts of ways that I know our people had complex and deep discussions about our artistic practices. So actually, there are many words that that may not embody what those 3 little letters mean or have come to represent, but in terms of bringing it back to dance, I use this designation to bring their work into dialogue with many of the other types of performance and dance works that are being created, and also to give their work the due credit for its complexity and sophistication. So due to the limited amount of time that we have today, I'm going to focus solely on the work of Sa'aplaq as an example. My analysis will focus on his 2011 collaborative performance entitled Thunderbird. So holding myself accountable to protocol as well as the ethics inherent to conducting research in First Nations communities, I've sought and received Sa'aplaq's permission to research and write about his practice. I'm grateful for his trust. As an Indian residential school survivor, Sa'aplaq has dedicated his life to reviving, learning, and enacting Chiach, Squamish protocol, through his leadership and involvement in ocean-going canoe journeys, private Coast Salish ceremonies, and public performances with his dance group, Spakwastolum. All the members of his dance group are from the Squamish Nation. Their people's traditional and unceded territory includes the lower mainland of Vancouver, Howe Sound, and the Whistler Corridor in British Columbia. They perform the songs and dances they have inherited rights to through their nations, families, and communities, as well as songs and dances that are created by Sa'aplaq. In 2010, Sa'aplaq collaborated with Julia Taff, artistic director of Ariosa, on a performance called Thunderbird. Their work brought together Spakwastolum with Ariosa, shown here, a Vancouver-based company that combines Western contemporary dance techniques with safe rope rigging systems to create 3-dimensional performances that reinterpret gravity and respond to the performance location. Thunderbird was performed on the outside wall of an office tower next to the Vancouver Public Library and on the ground at the tower's base in Library Square in Vancouver. 6 of Ariosa's members danced while rappelling down the 22-story tower as 7 of Spakwastolum's dancers performed on the ground below. In the planning stages of their collaboration, Sa'aplaq and Taft discussed how they would engage with each other's practice and the site's location. Sa'aplaq shared with Taft that he conceptualized Ariosa's collective descent down the building as a, quote, a canoe arriving in Squamish territory from the sky. He then enacted a shared protocol common to Northwest Coast First Nations canoe landings, where each canoe is introduced into the territory through song, dance, and oratory by its paddlers, who then ask the nation or community they are approaching for permission to land. Sa'aplaq observed that the Thunderbird song, which he was in the process of composing, would be appropriate because it was a song that belonged to the sky. He described Thunderbird as a supernatural being that perches his feet on top of 2 North Shore mountains that were just adjacent of this building, known to the Squamish as the Sisters. In the same manner that many Squamish paddle songs are used to ask for safe passage along the water, his Thunderbird song asked for the Thunderbird's permission and blessing for Ariosa's passage through its domain as the dancers rappelled down the building to descend in to arrive into his people's territory. So I'm just going to show a clip just so you can get a sense of I'm just going to put it on hold right there and I'll play the rest. So in response to Saaplach Chiach, the Squamish protocol that he was enacting in their collaboration, Taft created the choreography that you see here. And in that choreography, she created canoe patterns and motions for Ariosa that emulated the movements of the waves rolling in and out along the shoreline. See us, guys. The final segment of Ariosa's performance alongside the tower was the most treacherous. So in order for their rigging system to be safe for onlookers below and also people entering in and out of the tower, the ropes end about 30 feet before the ground. The building is so large that the riggers, that they call them, are on the opposite side of the building. So when they get to that point in the performance, the riggers, without seeing the dancers, lower them to the ground. Very treacherous. So in again enacting Chiach, Saaplach, he chose to share a prayer song. And this prayer song he chose, Slomo Slolum, is a woman's paddle song. And all the dancers that you see here, one of the reasons why he chose it, they're all women that were dancing along the building there. And the history of the song, it goes back to the Great Fire of Vancouver in 1886, where the whole city nearly burnt down. It was the women, this is Bob's oratory right now, it was the women who started to rescue the survivors. And in the process of doing that, paddling the survivors to the North Shore, they created a song to keep the spirits light in the canoe. That song has come down to us over the years, the Woman's Paddle Song. We use it to mark this occasion, to bless this occasion, and being on the Ariosa being on the ground with us and our meeting. Once Ariosa landed, they sang Etas Bakwas, Gathering of Eagles, in celebration of their two groups in this collaboration. Ariosa then joined Bakwas Stolum in dancing the Squamish Eagle Dance, which you see here, and also invited witnesses to participate in this dance together. Saaplach's conceptualization of this collaboration through Chiach declared that Squamish territory is not only limited to land and sea, but it also encompasses the sky. Its references to Thunderbird affirms its place in the cosmology, their cosmology, as a supernatural being belonging to the celestial realm. Using Slomo Slolum, the women's paddle song, as a prayer song for Ariosa's safety is further illustrative of the continuity of his people's practice of writing their engagement with the wider population of what is now Vancouver into their songs and dances. This is just one of the innumerable examples in my dissertation that demonstrate how new songs and dances, as well as dance group performances, can be viewed from many perspectives as a rich art historical record reflecting changes, continuities, and priorities of Northwest Coast First Nations people today. Now, I will depart from my dance research and the ways in which I'm decolonizing my own approach to Northwest Coast First Nations art history in order to pose more questions in effort to initiate what I hope is a courageous conversation that will enact change in our field. One of the points that Caleb made when it was your question brought up, thinking about whether or not we are going to be able to remain and identify as First Nations people in the next generation, identity lost essentially. And what I liked in Caleb's response is he said, with fear comes responsibility. So I'm going to share with you my fear. Where are the Indigenous scholars in the study of Northwest Coast art history? To the best of my knowledge, when I defend next month, I will be the first Northwest Coast First Nations person to get a PhD specifically in this field. The next is Marcia Crosby, a Tsimshian and Haida scholar who will be receiving her PhD in art history from UBC later this year. Are there really only two of us? I would love to be proven wrong. Everywhere I go, I ask, and I asked Katie just yesterday, so are there Alaska Native Northwest Coast First Nations students that you know of? And because, and I'm specifically, again, referring to art history, not anthropology or related fields. So when I started my academic journey fresh out of high school in 1998, I honestly thought that by the time I finished my PhD, I would be a part of a cohort of Southeast Alaska Natives and Northwest Coast First Nations graduate students. I'm not at all assuming that First Nations scholars in this field will decolonize it. It's not that simple. In fact, there are Indigenous scholars in many fields who reproduce colonial methodologies. Many of the non-Indigenous scholars you'll hear from today have been adopted into clans. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's our people's way. But what about those of us who are born with these responsibilities to our people, to our communities, to our clans, and the wider Indigenous population? I'm simply asking, where are the Tlingit, Nuuchnuth, Kwakwaka'wakw, Haisla, Gitxsan, Niska, and other coastal peoples in the field of Northwest Coast art history? We know that Indigenous art historians exist within our communities. In fact, much of the work that has been published in our field is a combination of their knowledge and archival research. But why is it that this academic route is not bursting with Northwest Coast First Nations people, scholars? What is it about the field that seems inaccessible, uninviting, or privileged? How can we affirm, as Corinne kept saying, these affirmations, how can we affirm their knowledge and bring them into universities and help and support their academic journey so that they can be the ones teaching these classes? The greater university system is also no doubt accountable for this huge and unjust discrepancy, but what are we as scholars in this field doing about it? How many scholars here are actively demystifying the academic process, as Maori scholar Graham Smith calls it, by speaking with community members about their own academic journey when they are in the process of conducting community-based research? How many scholars here talk to Alaska Natives and First Nations high school students and undergraduates about going into art history to deepen their knowledge and contribute to the preservation and perpetuation of the knowledge that exists within their communities? My career is a direct result of two people who did something about this. My entry into the field began with a meeting with Robin Wright when I was 16 years old. She came to my village and I was a tour guide. And she opened my eyes to the fact that I could actually go to school for the work that I was already doing for my community. A year later, I met Aldona Janitis, who not only encouraged me to go into this field, but told me, I should say, not reminded me, she told me, keep your grades high so that you can find funding, and I did. Both of these women have been incredible supporters and mentors in my life since. Being one of 2 Northwest Coast First Nations scholars in this field doesn't make me feel special. It can be lonely, sad, and at times frustrating in ways that only other Indigenous people in academia can understand. Still, it motivates me to continue my career in academia and eventually find a position where I could bring our people into graduate work. I'm not discrediting the work of all of these brilliant non-Indigenous scholars. They have been my allies, supporters, and I theirs. But I feel I need to reciprocate their time, energy, and support among my own people. We have a beautiful Alutiiq example of Indigenous mentorship between Sven and Nadia that I would love to see between Northwest Coast First Nations people in art history. What changes, and I'll leave you with this question, what changes do we have to make in as the next generation of leading scholars with the support of those who essentially founded this field to make that happen? Do'oh system.
That is such an incredible act to follow, and I'm so excited. Been kind of with her on her journey as a friend and a sharer of research and papers, and I just am so excited to be attending your defense in 2 weeks on April 14th in Vancouver. It's going to be a really amazing thing. I also want to thank Joe for welcoming us here. It was a really beautiful way to start the day, and I thank you very much. I want to thank Katie for organizing this amazing opportunity to bring all of these people together and everybody else at the Burke. It's really exciting to be here and to see the incredible work that's going on. And I hope that my work will contribute in some small way to this ongoing dialogue. And I really welcome feedback on my paper, because this is something that is going to be in my book eventually, and so I enjoy hearing how it sounds. So the concept of resilience is the thread that binds this talk together. Since the 19th century, the rigid categories that developed from the institutions of settler colonialism have created hierarchies of value in terms of ethnicity, gender, and the materiality of visual culture, the combination of which has marginalized the cultural expressions of Indigenous women. Though settler colonialism has operated against Indigenous people of all genders, I have argued elsewhere that these categories initially made space for Indigenous women to continue passing along cultural knowledge through the production of woven robes, baskets, and beadwork in ways that have not been recognized in the art historical literature until very recently. However, as the imposed patriarchal categories of value became absorbed into the cultural practices of Indigenous people, the balance between men and women has shifted. The repercussions of that shift are deep and complex, though perhaps most visible in terms of the development of the Northwest Coast art market since the 1960s, which has heavily favored the carved and painted work of men over the woven and sewn work of women. As I hope to demonstrate in my talk today, it is the very flexibility of the materials and methods used by women that embodies the resilience through which they have accommodated, adapted, and resisted the onslaught of settler colonialism. In recent years, this gendered imbalance has begun to adjust incrementally, driven in part by Indigenous artists who are addressing the central roles of women in the transmission of cultural knowledge. The shift is apparent in the work of the 6 women in the Here and Now exhibition. Though Alison Bremner, Pat Courtney Gold, Luann Neal, Lisa Telford, Evelyn Vanderhoop, and Shken George, who's the topic of my talk today, utilize different materials and methods, the very diversity of their artworks speak to the resilience of the women who maintained important cultural knowledge through the transmission of aesthetic and technical abilities from one generation to the next. I think it is also important to point out that Here and Now is highly unusual in terms of the ratio of female to male artists. Of the 15 talented artists in this exhibition, 6 are women. As any informal survey of Northwest Coast art exhibitions will reveal, the work of men tends to vastly outnumber that of women. I want to acknowledge Katie Bun-Marcuse, for her amazing curatorial work that also contributes to shifting this equilibrium within this particular arena. And I also was really moved by the slide that you showed yesterday, Robin, of kind of the genealogy of anthropology and art history, and the fact that so many more women are entering into the field of art history, that I think this is going to continue to shift, and that balance may come back a little bit. Though I wish I could talk about the work of all of the women in this exhibition, in the brief time I have today, I must limit myself to a discussion of some of the ways in which Skendu Tan George's series of woven and appliqued octopus bags unsettled the history of settler colonialism and its repercussions in Southeast Alaska. Not only do the bags embody the ways in which early encounters, the imposition of religion, and salvage ethnography contribute to the complexities of the present day, but they also reinforce Tlingit ways of knowing that have survived or been revived due to the efforts of women. Through her bags, George approaches this history in a subtle manner, using the materiality of copper, weaving, applique, and beadwork to acknowledge Tlingit women's resilience throughout the past 2 centuries. Due to their origins and uses, octopus bags are a particularly powerful expression of this intercultural history. And just a photo, Shken had her first one-woman show in Juneau, and just a picture of her at her show this summer. And then on the right, of course, the bag that's in the Here and Now exhibition. And Shken now has a baby daughter who I think is 3 months old now, so she was pregnant in that picture. Made from trade cloth and embellished with seed beads, octopus bags arrived in Tlingit territory via indigenous trade routes in the last quarter of the 19th century. As I have argued elsewhere, perhaps due in part to their resonance with Russian Orthodox church banners, as well as the significance of 4 and 8 within Tlingit cultural practices, they quickly became widespread throughout Southeast Alaska. Initially, octopus bags signified exclusive rights to important trade routes to the interior, but they eventually became a popular item of ceremonial regalia worn by women and men throughout the region. Early bags, either traded into Southeast Alaska or made locally, were embellished with a wide range of designs inspired by interior Dene floral beading practices and Victorian decorative scroll motifs. In this era, Tlingit women developed an original pattern still in use today, identified as seaweed or kelp, that more accurately represented the local environment and cultural concerns, and in souvenir form on moccasins and wall pockets, served as a distraction from the continuation of important cultural practices despite the attempts to suppress them. Beaded seaweed designs are well known within Tlingit communities, but have rarely appeared in academic scholarship. The designs indicate the importance of all types of seaweed to the health and well-being of Tlingit people in terms of sustenance, medicine, and other social and spiritual attachments to place. Some seaweed, such as kelp, was used as fishing line or is known as a good place to gather herring eggs, whereas other types were dried and eaten or sold within the cash economy that emerged after contact. More recently, it has been integrated into celebration through a black seaweed contest, which awards prizes based on the taste and texture of the locally processed vitamin-rich food. Kelp has been integrated into the ceremonial practices of specific clans, such as the Ravens from Angoon, who have a kelp dance that emulates the movement of seaweed as the tide changes. Ethnographer George Emmons also noted a raven seaweed crest, though he did not state its clan association. In these ways and others, seaweed is implicated in everything from physical survival to cultural revival. Some of you may recognize the bag on the left, also in the Here and Now exhibition in the Burks collection here. In George's hands, this design takes on another layer of meaning, becoming a metaphor of women's wealth through its rendering in copper, a material of affluence along the entire coast. Though copper seems rigid and inflexible, it is in fact one of the softest and most workable metals. As such, there is a natural affinity between copper and the materials typically used by women, and thus becomes an appropriate material to represent some aspects of women's wealth. Women's wealth includes the skills and knowledge passed down from generation to generation, not only in terms of the gathering and processing of seaweed and other food items to feed family and community, but more broadly, the weaving, sewing, and beading practices used to communicate personal and clan membership, as well as indigenous ways of knowing. The transformation of the kelp design from beadwork into copper is a powerful acknowledgement of women's resilience in the face of settler colonialism. While copper seaweed may represent tangible aspects of women's wealth, the woven octopus bag currently on display in Here and Now suggests the intangible wealth of clan histories, family connections, and the acquisition of artistic abilities. The design of George's bag references her Deklawaty clan house, the Killer Whale Tooth House in Angoon, where she grew up. Like so many other Tlingit women, she learned how to bead from her paternal grandmother, the late Lydia George. Shken George credits the cultural knowledge and oratory of her community, as well as the practice of her mother, wildlife artist Joanne George, for influencing her own artistic path. In addition to obtaining a fine arts degree and spending a semester at the IAIA, she furthered her artistic growth by apprenticing with Clarissa Rizal to learn Chilkat or Nahin weaving, and with Cheryl Samuel to learn Raven's Tail. The diversity of George's artistic education enables her to weave the threads of Tlingit ways of knowing through the fiber of settler colonialism, evoking the complexities of contemporary Tlingit identity. Combining Chilkat and Raven's Tail weaving techniques, the design of this bag resonates with the 19th century potlatch practice of tearing and distributing Chilkat robes to pay high-ranked witnesses. Though George's bag depicts a completed design, those fragments of distributed robes were imbued with so much status and meaning, they were often transformed into new items of regalia, such as leggings, hats, and bags, and worn at subsequent events. In a subtle way, similar to rendering seaweed from copper, the seemingly fragmented Chilkat design in the shape of an octopus bag links women's aesthetic abilities to the customary roles of Tlingit women within trade relationships through marriage and as expert negotiators, both of which contributed to the acquisition of wealth. This bag serves as a reassertion of the significance of those aspects of Tlingit women's lives that were devalued by the structures of settler colonialism. Moreover, the Raven's Tail design, visible at the end of each tab or leg, you can just see a little bit at the very bottom, embodies the ways in which women, both indigenous and settler, work to revive and pass on this previously lost technique. Unlike the customary practices of Chilkat weaving, in which men design and women weave, Tlingit women both design and execute Raven's Tail. The designs themselves relate to patterns found on spruce root baskets, which are believed to derive from porcupine quillwork patterns created by interior Athabascan-speaking women and acquired by Tlingit people through trade and intermarriage. These connections underline the deep history of design attributed specifically to women and the resilience with which they can be adapted to different materials and forms. Though I don't have time to discuss them here, the revival of Raven's Tail brings up an assortment of other issues concerning the complexities of settler colonialism, particularly in terms of museums and the development of gendered hierarchies of value, as well as the preservation of pre- or early contact cultural expressions and the ways in which they are brought back into practice, circulated, and gain meaning in 21st century contexts. Like her woven octopus bag, this innovative bag also illustrates George's clan crest. Cut from an applique of a killer whale and beaded with flowing designs representing the mist evacuated from a whale's blowhole, this unique octopus bag is unusual in that it incorporates a crest design. By adding a crest to a piece of regalia that typically does not incorporate those designs, George highlights the centrality of one's clan identity, which is customarily acquired matrilineally, though, as the Dauenhauers have pointed out, this aspect of Tlingit cultural practices was undermined through the imposition of patrilineal laws of inheritance, which has contributed to a reorientation of Tlingit social organization from one of what they call traditional ethnicity to civic ethnicity. Moreover, like the transformation of beaded seaweed designs into copper, George's purposeful transformation of the curving Victorian floral motifs into killer whale spouts suggests the ongoing recognition and reclamation of the power of Tlingit women, particularly as it overlays the applique crest. The layering of multiple motifs and meanings acknowledges the intercultural realities of the present, but also engages with concerns around the access to and translation of cultural knowledge. In a recent artist statement, George noted, quote, "Each of my bags has its own secret. I have always been drawn to the art that is more than its first impression," end quote. Her comment is revealing of how the nuanced use of material has meanings that are not accessible on first view or to everyone. Though the secrets alluded to by George tend to be aesthetic in nature, for example, the fabric used to line this bag, which is covered in killer whales as well, our conversations over several years have touched on who has the access to or the right to share certain kinds of knowledge. This has become an increasingly important dialogue that has grown just as public displays of crests and regalia have flourished. For various reasons stemming from differences in settler colonial histories, this debate is further along in British Columbia. Particularly relevant to the consideration of George's octopus bags is the work of Kwakwaka'wakw artist Marianne Nicholson, whose multifaceted works, such as this 2010 piece, What Need to Hide, to Be Hidden, powerfully demonstrates the need to regulate cultural boundaries and the importance of including women and their knowledge in the process. And this is a series of boxes that are probably 2 to 3 feet, and you can't see what's inside of them until you're up and looking down in them. And inside, she has photographs of her relatives kind of hidden away inside. And you can see that the designs on the inside is all on the insides of the box. It's kind of container of knowledge. Though not as overtly as Nicholson, George's work resonates with these concepts by using buttons to emphasize the dorsal fin, the most frequently observed and easily recognized characteristic of the killer whale. The part of the design concealed on the back includes the eye, mouth, and pectoral flipper, suggesting that some types of knowledge are only visible to and communicable by specific individuals. The layering of each design element in this killer whale bag acts as a metaphor for the reclamation of women's power and knowledge and the care with which it should be transmitted. As George herself notes, the beadwork is the first thing you notice, but as you take more time to look, the other layers become apparent. The whole process of its creation seems to stand in for the history of intercultural relations on the Northwest coast. The crest, cut from whole cloth, is nearly destroyed, yet when it is put back together and embellished, it becomes something more than it was, suggesting a way forward, a renewed strength, and the ability to determine the boundaries of cultural knowledge. In his 1921 discussion of spruce root basketry, Tlingit ethnographer Louis Shotridge noted the importance of women to the continuation of cultural practices despite the pressures of settler colonialism. Quote, "An invader might satisfy himself in saying that the native customs and habits have about disappeared, but could the lid of the true woman's mind be thrown wide open, there would be seen the mystic veneration of her art still alive and active." Shotridge eloquently points out that as the more overt cultural practices of Tlingit people were being suppressed and outsiders were committing salvage ethnography, women were maintaining Tlingit ways of knowing in quiet yet powerful ways. Nonetheless, despite this recognition of women's abilities in this history, the legacies of settler colonialism have contributed to the alteration and devaluation of their customary roles and cultural expressions. While men and women have had to adjust to new economic and social opportunities of the past couple of centuries, since the advent of the Northwest Coast fine arts market in the 1960s, the institutions of settler colonialism have benefited men far more than women. As I hope to have shown today, Shkendu Tan George's woven and appliqued octopus bags embody the cultural continuity noted by Shotridge through expressions of resilience in terms of the execution of the designs and the materials she uses. George subtly acknowledges the multiple layers of meaning accreted to the seaweed design specifically and octopus bags more generally. George and other female indigenous artists along the coast illustrate the value that women in their work should be accorded, both within cultural practices and for the Northwest Coast art market, which continues to privilege men's cultural expressions over women's. George affirms the customary status of the materials, motifs, and techniques she uses, but also acknowledges that their recombination and subsequent transformation embodies the ongoing resilience of Tlingit women and suggests some of the ways in which she is unsettling the past to create a more equitable future. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for a space for courageous conversations. And thanks to all of you at the Burke and supporters of the Burke who make this space possible. My talk today is about 2 house posts next door at the Burke Museum. I hope most of you are familiar with them, and some of you might already be familiar with this work because it was published in the spirit of our ancestors. But I've never had a chance to present it myself at the Burke, and so I wanted to present it today, and I also think it ties nicely in with the morning's discussion about decolonization within museums. So before I get to any of that, I need to take you back to a very different time and place. In July of 1899, SS George W. Elder anchored off the beach of the Tlingit village of Gosh, located near Cape Fox in southern southeast Alaska. The last stop on a 2-month expedition to Alaska, sponsored by the railroad magnate Edward H. Harriman, Gash appeared to expedition members as a deserted village, the very title that expedition photographer Edward S. Curtis gave to the photograph that he took from the shore. The Harriman expedition consisted of some of the finest thinkers in science and arts of the day: John Muir, C. Hart Merriam, George Bird Grinnell, as well as Edward Curtis, who together would produce 13 volumes of scholarship based on the information they had gathered from 2 months in Alaska. But the group would also amass a large collection of Tlingit clan property known as Ut'u, which literally translates as owned or purchased thing, but which denotes the most prized crest objects that a Tlingit clan can collectively own. And this is just a small group of what they took. Believing that Gosh was permanently deserted, members of the Harriman expedition removed 4 totem poles, 4 house posts, the entire house front of the Tequati grizzly bear house, several box drums, bentwood boxes, and masks. These Ut'u were later donated to museums across the United States, including the Burke, where they would remain for the next 100 years. Among the confiscated Ut'u were 2 house posts taken from the Tequati Kotz house, which were eventually reunited in the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture. These house posts depict the Tequati crest story of the grizzly bear who married the hunter Kotz. Some versions of the Tequati story, Kotz has promised his bear wife never to look at his human wife again, and in some versions he's tricked into seeing his wife, and some he purposefully seeks out his wife. But in any case, for that betrayal, his bear cub children tear him to pieces. And when the grizzly bear wife finds his body, she cries the mournful song of the loon. The Tequati brown bear post stood together for nearly 70 years at the Burke Museum, no longer proclaiming their crests in the clan house at Gosh. Their role was to teach a museum audience about Tlingit art and culture. Then, in 1999, 100 years after the Harriman expedition had removed the post from Alaska, Cape Fox Heritage Corporation filed a repatriation claim for the Tequati house posts. The 1990 passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, had turned the tables on assumptions like Harriman's, that Native property should be distributed in the name of science, and affirmed the right of Native peoples to protect and direct their own cultural patrimony. Reviewing Cape Fox's repatriation claim, curators at the Burke recognized the Tequati house posts were stolen property and arranged to return them to Alaska, which is what you see here. And I think it's really cool because they were returned on the Harriman, Alaska Expedition Retraced, which was a group of scientists from Smith College who organized this. I know Robin Wright got to go, Dr. Rosita Worrell. There were many people who went in part to compare some of the data from the 1899 expedition with 2001. So it kind of came full circle with the return of these house posts. But the return of the Tequati Kotz post to Alaska is the start of my talk. The real interest in my talk is what happens next. Responding to the return of their Ut'u with an act rooted in principles of balance and reciprocity, Tlingit individuals and corporations organized to give something back to the Burke Museum. Not replications of the Kotz post per se, but artworks that honored the crests of the posts at the same time they asserted a new Tlingit presence in the Burke Museum. And as I understand it from Robin, it was Dr. Rosita Worrell, who's president of Sealaska Heritage Institute, who really prodded her to have both Nathan and Stephen design house posts to replace these 2 house posts that had been repatriated. In 2001, and so Cape Fox Corporation, which is the village corporation for the Sanya Kwan, donated a cedar log to the Burke Museum to kind of make some of this commission possible. This was the cedar log that Nathan Jackson would use to carve his new house post. In 2001, with additional funds from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Ferguson Foundation, and several other private donors, the Burke commissioned 2 new COTS house posts from Tlingit master carver Nathan Jackson and his son Stephen Jackson. Dedicated in August 2005, the Jackson posts represent an important new chapter in the story of COTS and in the relationship between Tlingit peoples and the museums in the NAGPRA era. Now, I just want to note briefly, most of you may know this, but there was a whole series of these commissions of the Jacksons to create artwork for museums to replace artwork that had been repatriated. And I was a precocious graduate student when all this was going on. I was so excited about it, and Stephen Jackson said, "Emily, we need a word. We need a word for this new practice." Oh, so I should just say, on the left here in 2000, the Harvard Peabody was the first to dedicate the new pole by Nathan Jackson to replace, again, a Tequati COTS pole that had been stolen from Gosh. The second from the left is at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. That was in 2004. They dedicated it at their opening. The 2 house posts at the Burke are next, and then 2007, the Field Museum in Chicago also dedicated a pole where Nathan and Stephen collaborated on the same pole. So this is a crazy made-up word, and you can take it or leave it. But Stephen Jackson put me up to this, and it was the idea that with all of this new act of repatriating work under NAGPRA, that there can be this reciprocation, the sending forth of objects from the patria or homeland. So this was our word, propatriation, which all my Latin friends say does not actually work. But pro being sending forth, pro-Tlingit, all kinds of ways that you could read that. In any case, I won't focus on the words themselves. In designing their house post for the Burke, neither Nathan or Stephen chose to replicate the Gosh post they would replace. "I felt that the original pole was the original pole," Nathan said of this decision. "I would make a rendition of my own." Nathan's emphasis on remaining faithful to the story of COTS rather than to its exact physical representation honors Tlingit belief that the right to an origin story, crest, name, song, or other object of A'u claimed by an individual or clan matters more than the physical representation of that right. So this is part of those intangible aspects of Tlingit A'u. It also represents a refusal to provide the Burke a copy of A'u that had never been rightfully purchased or recognized as required by Tlingit tradition at a ku'ich, or a potlatch. Nathan's rendition of the COTS story differs from the Gosh post on several fronts. He shortened the snout of the bear, since he felt that the long nose of the Gosh post might have been mistaken for a wolf. So here you can see on the left was the original house post taken from the Tequati grizzly bear house, and on the right is Nathan's post. And instead of the small inverted human figure caught with outstretched hands in the great bear's mouth, a human figure which has been interpreted as a slave, rival, or debtor of the Tequati clan, or as COTS himself, Nathan chose to depict the hunter COTS upright in his bear wife's embrace. And Stephen has called this COTS's honeymoon. This was when all was still going well between COTS and his wife. Nathan also departed from the original paint scheme of the Gosh post, applying black, red, and blue-green latex paints far more sparingly to his post, far more sparingly. And what that leaves is his signature stippling technique of that adze work. I love seeing the rhythmic surface of his work. If Nathan departed from the Gosh post for his reinterpretation for the Burke, Stephen's house post veers in a completely new direction. In technique, form, and subject matter, the post asserts a radically different presence than the Cape Fox post that it replaces. Stephen chose to depict COTS's story's violent climax, when the Bear children tear their father to pieces for having betrayed their mother. And he was very conscious about the reasons he chose this part of the story. He said he wanted to give the cultural disruption that the Harriman expedition had wrought upon the Sanya Kwan. He wanted to give that cultural disruption back to the museum. Didn't want this to just be this kind of pretty piece to go back and replace. He wanted people to have to deal with this history. In a composition that Stephen has described as multiple exposures of Kot's dismemberment and death, fingers drip with bloody sinews, ligaments strained to hold, and intestine-like forms writhe across the surface of the post. But if one accuses this post of abandoning Northwest Coast design completely, note first the motifs that emerge in its folds. We have ovoids, capping the muscles of the abdomen, U-forms, embedded in the guts, all kinds of good Northwest Coast design. Even the swirl of intestine and sinew recalls the role of the primary form line in Bill Holmes' classic definition to create a kind of continuous flowing grid over the whole decorated area. So I would like to champion this work as Stephen really looking closely at some of the form line principles and putting it into epoxy resin. To me, the coolest thing about Stephen's work is, as he has put it, it sticks out like a sore thumb in the Burke Museum. It's very different from a lot of the classical work that's around it. And my experience being in that space is that it draws people to it to figure out why it's part of the collection. And what happens because of that result, because he's drawing people on the opposite side of that post, which, by the way, I love that the Burke has used these as house posts, placing them against the pillars of the actual museum. But on the other side of that post is a long piece of wall text that explains the history of the Harriman expedition, that explains the repatriation under NAGPRA, that talks about Cape Fox Corporation's gift of a cedar log, and this new relationship that has ensued because of these works of reciprocation. So to me, it's so important that museums have a space where they can critically reflect on colonial practices of collecting. And this is what I think these house posts provide us with. I love watching people encounter them. Stephen has emphasized that he doesn't see the act of propatriation as, quote, closing the circle of the Harriman expedition. The propatriated post cannot and purposefully does not equalize the repatriated post, nor can the return of the Gosh posts amend for the century that the Take-Waity people endured without them. Like all acts of gift-giving, then, propatriation introduces an asymmetrical relationship between the gifting parties. In Stephen's words, quote, the exchange is never complete, unquote. And yet what the exchange of the Cat's House Post has provided is a space in the museum where this asymmetrical exchange can be voiced and discussed, and a space where Tlingit interpretations of that exchange can be considered. If propatriation works to acknowledge objects returned from a museum with objects made for that museum, then it is not surprising that the practice has developed on the Northwest Coast. Here, practices of reciprocation are fundamental, so that propatriation, a kind of balancing of exchange objects, signals the vitality of Northwest Coast Native cultures in the NAGPRA era. It is a practice that behooves. While Native groups are reunited with their cultural patrimony, artists gain commissions, and museums build collections they can properly call their own. Unlike the Gosh posts, which had stood in the Burke as testaments to the vanishing Indian that the Harriman expedition believed they had traced, the Jackson posts stand as a renewed testament to Tlingit Shagun, looking both ways in time. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. That was a wonderful set of papers. I really appreciate hearing from all of you, and I think that we talked about this session as being retrospectives on Northwest Coast art history, and I think you did get a sense of that looking back into what some of the previous art history has been, and new methods in art history and indigenous methods in art history. And I think that these three women really set out some of the goals for the new art history on the Northwest Coast. Mike Yale's challenging the very categories of Northwest Coast art history. She's pushing for the study of performance and dance artists as subject, not as context only. Megan, your reflections on gender inequalities that have been imposed by the effects of settler colonialism, but also by art histories focuses on men's productions, and I think your scholarship works to heal some of the damage done to those traditional balances, and hopefully we'll work all towards that more in the future. And Emily, this story demonstrates one of the examples of decolonization in the museum clearly, but also I appreciate that your scholarship doesn't just place Stephen Jackson's work sort of in the category of the avant-garde or neo-native expressionism or whatever we're going to call it, but you don't, by doing that, when he's put into those categories, it often sets his work adrift from the clan histories that he's clearly very involved in. So it's nice to break down those categories that Mike Yale was talking about. And all of your work clearly reflects the fact that your relationships, which I think that's one of the key words we were discussing this morning in part of this decolonizing effort, that your relationships with the artists themselves have actually shaped the lens that you use to approach the artwork. So I applaud you all for your work in that vein. And so I'd like to open it up now to everybody here, and we have about 12 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more, to entertain questions.
I'd like to ask Dr. Smetser whether she feels that the increasing adoption of traditionally male art by women artists, does that redress the issue she's concerned about it, or does it, in a way, perpetuate it?
I think that's a really interesting question. It's not one that I've really thought too much about, but I think that in some ways it kind of perpetuates it. I think that because it's still the material being used is still the material that fits most easily into kind of imposed categories of fine art versus applied arts or craft, as women's work has often been referred to in the past. So I guess what I see, women who are working with basketry, like the wonderful talk we heard this morning by Pat Courtney Gold, that they are, that there's so much more going on in the creation of baskets and weaving and beadwork that has really been suppressed by the imposition of these hierarchies of value. And I think that, I think it's great that women are moving, are doing all of these things, but I think that what we need to look at is re-examine the work that has been created by women and continues to be created by women to understand the values that are deeply entrenched within the making of those sorts of things. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but.
Well, I just think this has been fabulous listening to you, the three of you talk, these brilliant talks have just been fabulous. A couple things. First of all, Megan, when the narrative of, let's say, Tlingit art history was that they lost the ability to make art at the end of the 19th century, and that got into all the textbooks, obviously. The women were making the most incredible baskets of anybody, and the women just kept on making these baskets, and no one recognized that this was the maintenance of incredible artistic culture. So thank you for that. But this question actually goes to all three of you. When I was giving some talks at a Tlingit community on Tlingit art history, this is a while ago, I showed Stephen and Nathan's posts to the group, and these were all Tlingit people. And the women all said, Nathan must be so embarrassed by his son. And I said, no, I know Nathan is extraordinarily proud of Stephen. Is they here? Are they here?
Yeah, he's right there. He's back there.
Oh my God!
I know he should.
I shouldn't be speaking for you. I didn't know you were here. But so what this leads me to is that all of you are talking about innovative new kinds of artistry based, of course, on the substance of what the history is all about. And yet, sometimes when an artist tries to do something unusually innovative, sometimes the communities are not necessarily that welcoming because they're not doing it right. So I would like you all to address the question of what does doing it right mean in the 21st post-colonial century?
I guess I'll go first. Well, it was actually my frustrations with the keynote that about the idea of doing it right, because doing it right privileges a type of wrongdoing that inhibits our artists in ways that I don't feel our ancestors were inhibited. You spend any time in museum collections, and literally every material that our ancestors encountered, every color fabric, every, it's amazing, it's amazing. There's a great exhibition and catalog called Objects of Exchange that is a very good example of all the different ways that materials were brought in, and Pat Courtney Gold's talk and analysis of historical baskets also spoke to that. And I think that there's a lot of colonial baggage that our communities carry around, and a lot of our artists carry around, and they kind of beat each other up with the baggage because of colonization and the horrifying attempts to assimilate our people through boarding schools, as they're called in the States, residential schools in Canada, and all of the different types of victimization that happened because of who we are and our identities. And I think that this talk about right and wrong is residual trauma, that it's a post-traumatic response to say, no, that's wrong. One example that I give, so I'm, like I said in my paper briefly, I'm a dancer and choreographer as well. I have a dance group in Vancouver called the Get High X that I lead with my husband, Mike D'Angeli. And we dance a photographer song that is based off my master's thesis research on photographer Benjamin Alfred Haldane, who started, a Tsimshian photographer who started a portrait studio in my community in 1899. And that song I use specifically for our witnesses, our audience, our communities. We dance in communities all over, all up and down the Northwest Coast, to think about what we do when we make those types of judgments, when we say that's not traditional. Traditional it's rather abusive. It's a rather abusive term when you think that if our people were using photography by 1899 to not only express our identities, but also a practice no different than documenting our history through totem poles, through songs, through dances, then who is to say what is not ours to do, right? Our people have an ancient tradition, if we want to use those words, of engaging with our contemporary times, and through this amazing foundation that we've inherited and in times revived of our ancestors to create works and in a range of materials, tools, technology. So I know I'm a carver myself, about the guy that was back there talking about men's and women's work. And I actually left carving because I heard from so many men, oh, women don't make it in this. Now I'm back and I'm carving because I'm done with my PhD and I love it, that I could get back to producing art. But I think that, again, that those are residual effects post-traumatic stress, that we've not only subscribed to the idea of these very narrow and static, the idea of being, it's the policing of authenticity. So it's these very narrow and static ideas of what make us First Nations people, that what makes me a Tsimshian, what makes me a Tlingit. And I think that we're doing is disjustice the right word? That we're doing dishonoring our ancestors by actually treating each other in that way and going about it so judgmentally. Because through those innovative practices of our ancestors, our art developed to what it is known for. And we are continuing both those practices and a range of other practices that are just as important.
I don't know how much I can add to that, but I mean, I'm not sure that I can. I do just want to say, though, that, I absolutely, everything Mike Yale said, I think is incredibly important. But I just want to say, in terms of the work that I've done, that there's this whole history of, in the mid-20th century, the Alaska Native Arts and Crafts Cooperative, and, there's a lot of things said about that. But one of the things I discovered when I was doing research for my dissertation on beadwork, 500 women throughout Southeast Alaska made beadwork for sale through the Alaska Native Arts and Crafts Cooperative. They continued those practices. Those practices have not been recorded anywhere except for in some archival spaces and in the memories of the women who were participants in ANAC and their mothers and grandmothers. And it's through those women who are doing beadwork, not authentic, not traditional, who were saving those kinds of ways of continuing knowledge to enable the kind of fluorescence of weaving, the reintroduction of Raven's tail weaving, the training of a whole new generation of Nahin weavers, that those beaders in the mid-20th century, they're the reason why there's such an amazing range of women's work being done today. So that would be my perspective on that.
Can I answer the question by asking if Nathan could take the microphone?
My Tlingit name is Yehiedi, which means raven child. And there's a new concept coming up where people have taken some of the old art and tried to add their own ideas. But I think one of the things that's pretty important is being able to draw. And when I was a small young fellow, that's one of the things that I enjoyed doing. And so I didn't really know that much about Northwest Coast art. I was challenged when I was a young fellow to carve a miniature pole, a couple of miniature poles, and but the new generation of carvers haven't really looked closely at some of the older stuff, which is a good learning tool. And I can't say that any of the carvings, there's an example of it up there, of doing real, true traditional. There are some artists that are very classic in style, and those individuals that have been on that trend have been well known in their works. One of them was from Wrangell, who was a Kiksadi, and his name, Tlingit name, is Kajies Dorch, and he has done things that carvings up in the Klukwan area where I'm from, and just being able to see some of those firsthand, very good examples of Northwest Coast art. But there are many that are in the Wrangell area, and I better give somebody else a chance to be able to speak out on this with this.
Maybe another question.
Thank you.
Would be good, because I think we've all gone around that question.
We're going to take one more question and have some brief answers, because we want to make sure that we don't run out of time to hear from the contemporary artists panel that is coming up next.
Yay,
So,
Luann.
Luann.
Yeah, really. No. I'm just wondering if all three of you can give an example of how you might have decolonized your research practice while you were doing this work.
I think that was my entire presentation, and I've talked a lot. I would say that a part of, that I didn't speak to, a part of my decolonizing my own methodologies is demystifying the process, as I talked about earlier. So I speak to classes a lot of youth, First Nations youth classes at Emily Carr. I've spoke at MOA to youth during their visits to the museum. So by MOA, I'm talking about the Museum of Anthropology. So I'm really, for the position that I'm in, I talked about, fear and responsibility as Caleb had mentioned, and I feel now that this fear of mine that we're not the ones who are getting our PhDs in the field, that eventually if we don't have our own scholars, then eventually the scholarship that is going to be produced is not going to be by our own people. And I said, I'm not discouraging anyone from going in the field, and I'm not discrediting my non-Indigenous cohort. It's just that part of my responsibility now that I've made it is to help others through, and that's that reciprocation that we're raised to have. So I think that is a part of my decolonizing my process, is to, by demystifying it, it's to speak to those who are interested, our young people, about this field and the potential, and how can I introduce you and get you into these institutions. And that's why I call upon all of us in this field to do something about it, because it can't just be me. Just like when Robin was, when Bill was first starting out, he got students into the program. So how can we think about going into these small communities? And there are tons of young people that are doing incredible work for their communities, that are learning on the fly, that are essentially working in museums, and are art historians themselves, the training that institutions can provide.
That's a great question, Luann. I think I would take mine in two different directions. One would be in working with the people that I have been interviewing over the years. So Shken and I have been talking, I think, since about 2002. And so we've had a lot of conversations. We have daughters about the same age, which is kind of cool. But we've had a lot of conversations about, we first started talking about beadwork, but now that she's moving into weaving, and that our conversations have shifted. I try to give her, when I write things about her, give it to her, get her feedback, so to build relationships of trust, I would say, would be one of the ways in which I've done that. I also, just a real quick story, I really wanted Larry McNeil to have a piece of his work in my book, which is coming. It's a beautiful image of his mother and his grandmother holding beaded moccasins, a photo from 1943. And so Mike Yell introduced me to Larry via email, and through our subsequent back and forths, he told me his mother and grandmother had beaded for Anak. And so next time I was in Juneau, I went to the Alaska Native Arts and Crafts archives. I looked up his mother and his grandmother in the files there. I copied them and I sent them to him, and it was so great because he said, well, it looks like my mom took a little bit of, her production went down in May 1955 for the few months after I was born. And I was just, it was brilliant. That's the kind of thing that I think is to be able to kind of bring together my archival abilities and to bring together the stories of people who I've developed relationships with, and to try and kind of re-center these histories in a different way, a way that it hasn't been done until really recently. I think it's changing, definitely changing, but it's a slow process. And then just in terms of times I've taught, I don't put myself out there as the expert. I say, we're going to look at a lot of different things, and I'm going to let you come to your own conclusions. I taught a class on Bill Reed, and that was a pretty amazing class because we debated, was there a Renaissance or not? And half the class had to argue for a Renaissance, and half the class had to argue against it. It was amazing. That was, because we really thought about the construction of that idea of the Renaissance of Northwest Coast art, and that really broke it down for the students. And I think that was a way of kind of decolonizing the classroom, in a sense, to really understand where our language comes from and how it's imposed onto lived histories.
Well, I'll just say that Mike Yell actually, when I was starting my graduate research, Mike Yell told me when I was about to go do interview work on Prince of Wales Island, she said, Emily, bring cookies to your interviews. Focus on building a relationship and not getting information. And that was really important for me to hear, because it calmed me down in my process of talking with people. I've invested years of of building relationships that I think build those relationships of trust. So that's on the kind of methodology side of research gathering, to focus on that. And a kind of private thing that I do that I feel really strongly about, and I haven't really talked about before, but to make sure that on a financial level, if now that I have a job, wow, I have a job, I'm no longer a grad student, I'm being paid to do art history. I feel really strongly about using some of the earnings that I make now to support Native arts programs in my home region of Ketchikan, the Totem Heritage Center. And so this is kind of a private thing for me, but I feel strongly about using some of those financial rewards that I've gained now to help support opportunities for learning in some of the arts that I get to study.